I'm not quite sure why I felt like this was a particular thing to share, but for some reason it seemed like the thing to do. So there's a particular relatively poorly formed theory that is nonetheless intriguing and I think meaningfully useful. And frankly, the degree to which it doesn't have substantial mainstream traction, I think, is part of why it might be useful to more clearly articulate it. And this is sometimes known as generational theory. It was popularized by Strauss and Howe um, about 20 years ago or so, maybe 30 years. And let me give you basically the sense of what I think is reasonably solid about it, and then maybe the more speculative elements, and then maybe a bit of how and why it might prove, well, useful now. So, to begin with, we have what I would think is a pretty straightforward proposition, and that is for human beings, there is a distinct difference between first person experience, second hand, third hand, and what I'll go ahead and coin as fourth hand. Um, and these kinds of experience happen because we have the particular characteristic of being born and then living for a specific amount of usually continuous time and then dying. Um, and so what that means is that we experience what it is that we experience firsthand ourselves. But of course, there's a gigantic amount of history that isn't part of our personal experience. Um, that which is the experience of people who are relatively contemporary to us, most notably our own parents, and aunts and uncles, they're our parents' siblings and our parents' friends and our own childhood friends' parents, like that generation, that cohort, tends to provide us with a second-hand kind of experience. So for my case, for example, I was born in 1971. So I have, for example, firsthand experience of the Reagan years. I have firsthand experience of the Challenger disaster. I have firsthand experience, obviously, of September 11th, the rise of the internet, the invention and broad development of the personal computer. These are all things that I have as personal experience. And embodied personal experience is in significantly richer than anything that can be conveyed um, socially, anything that can be conveyed linguistically. So then I have very limited personal experience of the Vietnam War. In point of fact, my mom and I actually lived on an airbase in Thailand for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, when I was very young. So I have a little bit of embodied experience of that piece. But more fundamentally, I have secondhand experience of the Vietnam War. It was very rich and alive in the culture when I was growing up. And more importantly, my father served in the Air Force during the war, and it played a meaningful role in his personal narrative. And of course, many of his friends also were part of the war. Um, and effectively, everybody in that particular generation was affected by it in some meaningful way. And so, in my case, I have a second-hand experience of the Vietnam War. I have direct, personal, firsthand experience with human beings who were themselves deeply impacted at firsthand by the event. So I have stories that were human, individual, personal stories. And I have an embodied sense of the consequences of those stories in a physical way. But I wasn't there, right? I didn't live it directly, and that difference makes a difference. So then, my grandfather served in World War II. So I have World War II kind of third hand. I mean, yes, I knew my grandfather and I spent time with him, but meaningfully less time than I spent with my own parents. Even less time with his siblings and his friends. And so my experience of World War II is much more um, mediated through pure story. Um, I have the stories that my parents told me. I definitely have the stories that the culture told me when I was growing up. Various official narratives around World War II, particularly movies, Patton and I think the Big Red One and the various John Wayne movies were commonplace. They were alive. We weren't that far away from World War II. And in fact, I think right now when I was a kid, we were closer to World War II than kids today were to the Reagan years, or something along those lines. So I certainly was aware of it, but I'm now aware of it as narrative, and not even really as lived first-person narrative, just very lightly, mostly as the reflected essence or even preferred interpretation of the event as it came through the filtered channels of many different layers of people telling the story. But nonetheless, there's still a sense of continuity, of connectedness. It holds a reality, a sense that, yeah, that really happened in a way that more distant past events don't. So now we can jump back far enough, let's say the American Civil War, which I now have as fourth hand, meaning I don't know anyone. Never have I ever met anyone who actually lived through the Civil War. In fact, I don't know anyone personally who knew anyone who lived through the period of the 1860 to 1865. Or if I do, I am not aware of that fact. Certainly the impact of the American Civil War is now received by me, and in fact, effectively by everybody that I know, as narrative, as story. And of course, at this point now, it's far enough away that the degree to which the story is only that portion of the story that has been able to maintain and hold itself in the retelling over a while, which means quite often losing an enormous amount, not only of the richness of first-person experience, but frankly, even of just really what happened. We might say that it's transitioned into myth. So first-hand is experience. Second-hand is second-hand. Third-hand we might call history, and fourth-hand we might call myth. And the difference between these kinds of ways of relating to what happened in the past, I think, are very meaningful for the way that human beings are able to, well, frankly, who we are. The kind of character, the kind of person that lived through the Battle of Stalingrad, the kind of person who first-person experience endured the reality of the kind of crisis that was associated with that period of time. Well, you can't get that kind of character if you haven't had that kind of experience. So what that means is that we have these, call it striations, of kinds of experiences that are associated with the flavors of experience that are available to people who are alive at a given period in time. Now, I don't want to over-determine, because obviously every distinct human being has a completely singular set of experiences, and that's crucial and irreducible. So this isn't a notion that we can reduce individuals to groups of this sort. But nonetheless, the point is that when an entire generation of Russians have, to a greater or lesser extent, had first-person experience with the Eastern Front, and an entire generation of Russians alive now simply have not had any possibility of experiencing anything even vaguely like it, that's a difference that makes a difference, all the way down. And so now we get to the second major point. So the first point, I think that there is a difference between first-person experience, second-hand experience, history, and mythology. Frankly, I feel pretty confident in. I mean, just the reality is that the kind of lessons and the kinds of wisdom and embodied wisdom that are associated with having literally lived through the Civil War just are not present to people alive now. It can't be. We've got our own, and our own are associated with the kind of lives that we happen to have lived and the lessons that are learned and coded in our bodies the hard way. So then the next part is to say, well, what kinds of phenomena might we expect to happen as a consequence of this? And here's where things can become more speculative and potentially more useful. So, for example, one of the propositions is if you look at what happened in the 1950s and 1960s, and in particular we look at what happened at, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you have JFK facing off with Khrushchev. What you have there is two individuals who have very distinct first-person experience with the negative consequences of war. Both individuals were physically in their bodies actually exposed to the horrors of war, and so had a level, a capacity to, I want to say empathize with, but in the abstract, how bad that actually is, in a way that almost nobody currently alive in the Western world has. And in fact, they weren't alone. There were lots of other people in their environment who shared that embodied experience of the horrors of war. And so therefore, even though enormous number of different kinds of institutional and even game theoretic forces were pushing in the direction of conflict, there was another counter pressure that was a deep embodied desire to avoid that kind of result that quite plausibly, meaningfully, played a role in preventing that from happening. And you might imagine that today, in an environment where the choice makers don't have that embodied experience. You look at the leaders of the Western world. In fact, you have to look at the leaders of the most powerful countries in the world in general. Effectively, none of them have any direct first-hand experience with, well, frankly, even anything meaningful, any meaningful duress. Most of them that did not even participate in the conflicts their countries did have. I do not believe that Putin was first person to the Afghan war. I don't believe that Trump was first person to the Vietnam War, and obviously neither was meaningfully first person to, or at all first person to, World War II, which was the last really serious systemic crisis that either of these countries faced. The Chinese have a slightly different timeline because the crises of the Cultural Revolution took place after the crisis of World War II, and so you do actually have a handful, not many, of folks who lived through that. You have a much larger handful who lived through Tiananmen Square, which is a different set of experiences and moral lessons. But still, you're looking at a group of individuals who are experientially second or third hand to anything which is truly, truly existential and intense. And so you might imagine that as these individuals, if they were put to the test of something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, they wouldn't have the advantage of embodied experience telling them that this is a place not to go. It's actually in some sense very simple. If you have, as a human, as a child, actually touched a hot stove, you have a very deeper sense of why you don't want to touch hot stoves than if you, say, watched your sister touch a hot stove, than if you heard your sister tell, don't touch a hot stove, than if you heard from a teacher at school say, don't touch hot stoves. Right? The distance from embodied experience to mythology or fourth-hand experience is enormous, and the ability of that, the potency of that experience to shape your choices is significant. So we can say that the second layer that we might deduce that deeply shared, which is to say large numbers of people in a given point in time, in a given society, who share similar levels of intensity of embodied experience. The specific qualities may be quite different, but the basic flavor of don't do that, for example, is relatively shared. We should expect to have political and sociological consequences. And then the lack thereof also to have political and sociological consequences. So then we get to the third, and then by far the most speculative point, which is to say, okay, then can we use that to generate some expectations? Is there perhaps a reason to believe that when you find yourself in a moment like now, where effectively all of the choice makers around the world are third hand dealing with the last major real consequences, the crisis of real serious existential conflict, and many of their constituencies are now at fourth hand, which is one of the things that we see in social media, for example, with millennials who have no awareness of the real feeling of actual crisis, um, might they not be reckless? Might they not be not fully able to embody a wisdom about why people don't like these kinds of things, and therefore be more willing to push, be more willing to take risks, be more willing to play a form of brinksmanship with themselves and with each others that is in fact categorically unwise. And therefore, of course, might we then find that this kind of circumstance where entire leadership groups in society are willing to take risks, are willing to be reckless, that if that happens to be the case, then we would expect to find bad choices to be made. And we would expect to find tipping points to be tipped over. And then we would expect to find that leading to crisis. So this then would be the final point, is to propose that it is precisely the degree to which crisis delivers embodied wisdom to enough people in society that the society itself, in some sense, carries that embodied wisdom, and therefore hangs together, studiously avoids the kinds of things like polarization and squabbling and sort of a ruthless struggle over small victories and self-aggrandizement, but rather focuses on maintaining the integrity of the whole, because they know that those kinds of breakdowns lead to very bad results all the way down to their bones. And that it is precisely the degree to which we have grown distant from those times and have moved from embodied wisdom to stories of our elders, to history books, to mythology, that we find ourselves vulnerable to making those bad choices, and thereby once again finding ourselves falling into the pit of those crises. Now, it's not clear whether the story is true. Worse, it's not clear, even if the story is true, how we might be able to use it to guide our own behaviors. It may very well be that it's nothing more than a thing that we can witness as we drive our car off the cliff, never having done it before and therefore not knowing how bad that can be. But perhaps we can hope that we have some capacity to learn in some way so that we can find ways to more fully and more effectively build an embodied wisdom so that we can, as a society, make good choices that don't involve constantly touching the hot stove.